I'd like to draw your attention to a very important quote by Father Edmund James O'Reilly. In his book, The Relations of the Church to Society, published in 1882, O'Reilly reflected on the Great Western Schism. That was that time of great confusion in the 14th and 15th centuries when 2 and even 3 men all claimed to be the Pope of the Catholic Church, all at the same time. And no one knew anymore who the true Pope was or how this whole mess could ever be resolved. So listen to these very instructive words of Father O'Reilly. Quote, "The Great Schism of the West suggests to me a reflection which I take the liberty of expressing here. If this schism had not occurred, the hypothesis of such a thing happening would appear to many chimerical. They would say it could not be. God would not permit the Church to come into so unhappy a situation. Heresies might spring up and spread and last painfully long, through the fault and to the perdition of their authors and abettors, to the great distress, too, of the faithful, increased by actual persecution in many places where the heretics were dominant. But that the true Church should remain between 30 and 40 years without a thoroughly ascertained head and representative of Christ on earth, this would not be. Yet it has been, and we have no guarantee that it will not be again, though we may fervently hope otherwise. What I would infer is that we must not be too ready to pronounce on what God may permit. We know with absolute certainty that He will fulfill His promises, not allowing anything to occur at variance with them, that He will sustain His church and enable her to triumph over all enemies and difficulties, that He will give to each of the faithful those graces which are needed for each one's service of Him and attainment of salvation, as He did during the Great Schism we have been considering, and in all the sufferings and trials which the Church has passed through from the beginning. We may also trust He will do a great deal more than what He has bound Himself to by His promises. We may look forward with a cheering probability to exemption for the future from some of the troubles and misfortunes that have befallen in the past. But we, or our successors in future generations of Christians, shall perhaps see stranger evils than have yet been experienced, even before the immediate approach of that great winding up of all things on earth that will precede the day of judgment. I am not setting up for a prophet, nor pretending to see unhappy wonders, of which I have no knowledge whatever. All I mean to convey is that contingencies regarding the Church, not excluded by the divine promises, cannot be regarded as practically impossible just because they would be terrible and distressing in a very high degree." Unquote. So remember this, folks. Remember this as you investigate Sedevacantism and try to figure out the nature of this terrible situation that we've all been in since the death of Pope Pius XII in 1958, and especially since Vatican II in the 1960s. You know, there are a lot of people out there who couldn't pass a single theology course, and yet they're very quick to tell you, oh, God would never permit this. You know, as though they knew what the infinitely wise and infinitely good God would and wouldn't permit. So when you're tempted to think that God would not permit for us not to have a pope for over 50 years, remember these wise words of Father O'Reilly, writing in 1882. Contingencies regarding the Church that are not strictly excluded by the divine promises cannot be regarded as practically impossible just because they would be terrible and distressing in a very high degree. So in other words, there is an infinite difference between impossible and improbable. And too often people see an obstacle, and because they don't like the difficulty that comes with it, they'll say, oh, God would never allow that. Well, the truth is that God would or could allow anything except that which he has strictly promised won't happen. That is what's impossible. And that includes that the Catholic Church should defect and become the ark of damnation rather than of salvation, or that the Holy See would no longer be the beacon of truth, that the Roman pontificate should fail. That's what's impossible. The Roman pontificate can be vacant, but it cannot fail. And if Francis is Pope, it has failed. That's it in a nutshell.